Page 448. Give me a thumbs up as soon as you're there. Awesome, Ria. Just wait for Monica, Kieran, Amber. Awesome. Great stuff. So, guys, unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Um, Pertinent subjects, especially when we talk about South Africa as a whole. But we realize, obviously, in South Africa specifically, that unemployment is a huge problem, and we'll obviously get into as to why that is the case. Uh, and it's very important that obviously we sit down and we try to measure what unemployment is, so that we can to begin to start curbing it as well. Now, the interesting thing about unemployment is that it's very hard for us to obviously define it. And your book has a couple of questions there that I think are pretty profound when you start thinking about unemployment as a whole. Right. This is the third sentence under 2.1.1. Says the following: we also know that a person who is searching for a job but cannot find one is unemployed. But what about a person who is not actively seeking work? What about someone who is only has a part-time job, or who is employed only for certain weeks or months of the year? And what about someone who makes a living, either legally or illegally, in the informal sector? Right? Are those individuals also considered unemployed? And that's a big question that we have to ask, because right now I believe that the unemployment rate, Ria, you will not believe it. They are not necessarily seen as full time. They're not seen as employment, no, because it's part time. We look at full contracts and we're looking at full time. It has to be a full time job for us to sit down and say you are employed. Harsh, right? Yeah, man. Yeah, man. You're unemployed. You've got a job, but according to the government, you'd be considered unemployed. And I think there's a bit of a problem in that type of thinking, because at the end of the day, if you're earning an income, you should be considered employed. That's my take around that. So part-time jobs, seasonal jobs, and stuff like that, you're considered what do they call that? Seasonal unemployment is what they would look at in that regard. But let's yes, you're 100%. Wow, Kieran, will not tell SARS that's how you feel. Um, yes, but Ria, to answer your question, and some people work multiple part-time jobs in a week. Absolutely, absolutely, and still they'll be seen as unemployed, seen as unemployed. So even now, for instance, with the gig that I have with VC, right? It'll be run for a whole full-on year, and then next year, obviously, we reapply to become lecturers and stuff like that as well. Um, Sometimes that can also be seen to some extent as part-time or contractual work, and therefore it becomes seasonal. So maybe I should also be asking myself, am I employed? Um, but jokes aside, guys, jokes aside, these are obviously serious things that we need to look at, because if we see 44% employed rate, and we've got the likes of Kieran and people who obviously are working multiple jobs and stuff like that, we really have to ask the question: are they really unemployed, or are we just not trying our best to be as precise as possible? So very good interaction there. Moving forward, they've got this thing called an unemployment pool. An unemployment pool. Now, the thing about this unemployment pool is that you find that people are entering the unemployment pool, but there are also people that are leaving the unemployment pool as well. And just in the chat, let me know, why do you think people would be entering the unemployment pool?
So can I answer like this? Because I don't know if I can type that fast.
Sure, no problem.
Um, I think people would be entering because either they resign. No, okay. Let me just ask this: if you resign, does that mean you are unemployed? Like, let's say
Absolutely.
you're like like let's say you're over 60 and you should be retired. Is that retired or unemployed?
That is unemployment because you no more have a job. So we can also put retired or
Yeah,
retiring.
yeah. You see how many old people are there in this country? You see, that's why the unemployment rate is not actually nah. Anyway, so either you resign, you get
Yeah,
fired, you get retrenched. I don't know if
yeah,
fired and retrenched is like it's not the same thing, but it's the same concept.
yeah.
Or um, I think that's the only stuff. I mean, the only things that are if you're entering, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So if you're entering that, it's definitely those. The book does have a couple more, but those are a very good starting point. And why? How do we leave the unemployment pool? How do we leave the unemployment pool? Yep. Get hired. You could get recalled. You know, that could be like a part-time gig that somebody sat down, or rather a full-time job, where they laid you off and they're like, "Look, work is back. We want you back." That could also be a form of people leaving the unemployment pool. Yes, go right ahead, Kier.
So do you know how in some industries you get people that freelance
Yes.
where like they might not work for a specific company, but they can work for multiple companies uh
Yes.
when they get called in. Is that considered 88? I mean, wow, did I just say 80? Is that considered unemployed?
That would be considered unemployed depending on how they structure their business. So you can be a freelancer, but be an entrepreneur in the sense that you have a company that you've registered. In that case, then you are employed because your company employs you, even though you've created it. But if you're going as a solo, or what you call it, what do they call those things? Those entrepreneurs that when you're one person running the show, I've just forgotten what, there's a specific name for it. If you're that person, then you can be considered as unemployed. So really what separates you is obviously a thing called taxes. Are you paying your taxes? If you are paying your taxes, then people might view you as employed. I hope that makes sense. Self-employed, not self-employed, real. I see what you're saying there. Um, there are four different types of ways you open up a company. You've got your partnerships, you've got your normal corporates, um, sole trader. That's the one. Awesome, Rhea. That's the one. That's the one.
Oh, so like, are there companies that you could be registered underneath that company specializes in freelancing? So if you need a freelancer, you call that company and they send someone. Is is
Yes,
that
there
what you're
are
saying?
companies that do that. And in that case, you would be seasonally unemployed because it means that when they have work, they hire you. When they don't have work, then they don't hire
Okay. So you are,
you.
if you're a freelancer, you're technically unemployed.
Yeah, technically you're unemployed.
Sheesh.
Pretty harsh,
Okay. Hey, no taxes.
yeah? All right. Oh. All right. So, basically, guys, when it comes down to your unemployment, and as you're putting across, it becomes a very sticky situation because we then say, for instance, right now with the whole 44%, I don't know if it's changed or if it's higher. You tend to ask yourself, who are these individuals and how did we get to that number? Which is a very good question to always ask. Don't just take everything for face value. Ask the question, wait a second, why is that the case? Why is that the case? Let's just do some quick highlighting on page 448. The unemployment pool. I want you to highlight basically those four paragraphs. Every single one of them is pretty important. those paragraphs under the unemployment pool. They obviously just deal with the concept that we're sharing on the board, being, what it takes to obviously join the unemployment pool and what it takes to obviously leave the unemployment pool, the criteria around that. Then under measuring unemployment, we would want to look at the third sentence, and it says the following. According to the strict definition, unemployed people are those people who, being 15 years and older, are not in paid employment or self-employment, where available for paid employment or self-employment during the 7 years preceding the interview, and took specific steps during the 4 weeks preceding to the interview to find paid employment or self-employment. The expanded definition, on the other hand, omits requirement C. In this case, we're talking about self-employment. In other words, the expanded definition requires only the desire to find employment. And I'm sure you'll look at the strict definition and still realize that there's a bit of a problem with that. There's a bit of a problem with that. How do you sit down and actually figure out this person has been searching for a job for X amount of years, or 7 days prior they had an interview? Things like that are not just the easiest things to say, to calculate. So I kind of look at that from that point of view as well. Moving right along though, on page 450, tell me, what do you guys feel are the costs when it comes down to the economy as a whole, are the costs of unemployment? What happens when people are unemployed in society, apart from the rise or the rising of crime? What are the reasons that are the costs that will happen as a result of unemployment? And we're talking about individually, but also as a society.
So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is a textbook answer, but it could be like a psychological thing where if you don't have a job and you just feel like, it's fine, I'll get it one day, and then eventually it's like, I'll get it one day, tomorrow's another day, but it's always tomorrow's another day, and it's like just a cycle that might go through a certain community, or like let's say a family chain where it's like, let's say the person who's older than you, who you look up to, doesn't have a job, and now you like, okay, well, if he doesn't have a job, why must I get one? And this is like a chain. It could be like a psychological thing. Is that a factor, or am I like just being?
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. Mental health, I think, definitely attributes to that, right? Um, and the problem with that is that that can affect quite a few individuals that are around you. And like you said, if you have somebody in the community that's unemployed and somebody looks up to that individual, they might say, what's the point of us actually going in? So eventually you get a chain of reaction that we otherwise would have never had somebody been employed. I see Ria's obviously putting across lack of money to acquire needs, absolutely, and that can be demoralizing. That can be demoralizing. You When you're not able to fend for yourself, when you're not able to go into a shop and say, I want that, and be able to purchase it, that does have an effect on you as an individual, not your ego, just you as an individual, because we cease to express ourselves in a certain manner. You actually going to, let's say, a restaurant and ordering the food that you want, drinking the wine that you want, for instance, that allows you to express yourself. You're expressing yourself. But if you can't do those simple, basic things, that becomes a bit of a problem, right? Amber, you talked about employment could cause a person to lack experience. Absolutely. And the thing about that, guys, is that if you have a whole community of individuals that have not gone to get skilled in whatever endeavor that they're doing, eventually you get into a position where the person can become unemployable because they just haven't worked any skills out, which is why I always advocate, and this is not me selling the organization, but I always advocate things like getting soft skills, like public speaking, for instance, from a organization called Toastmasters International. I don't know if you guys know that institution, but things like that. You know, you go there, learn leadership, you learn speaking, and that at least gives you some sort of skills to allow yourself not to necessarily fall off the bandwagon when it comes to unemployment. Because you can then sit down and go, do I engage myself in sales, or do I maybe start going into schools and start like giving inspirational messages and stuff like that? You know, things like that matter, which is also what certain companies look for when you have a CV. What were you doing during the years that you weren't employed? What did you show self-initiative? Things like that we'll also look into. Just from a textbook perspective, under the cost of unemployment, it says the following. It's the second sentence. It says, the individual who becomes unemployed suffers a loss of income, shock, and frustration. And I'm sure, you know, Kieran was also looking at these points as well, or express these points. In certain circumstances, unemployment can result in hunger, cold, ill health, and even death. Then just the last sentence in that specific paragraph, it says many people do not have access to unemployment benefits, and those who do receive benefits for a limited period only. I'm sure you guys have heard of UIF. Just give me a thumbs up if you've heard of UIF before. The Unemployment Insurance Fund. Yeah. So that's something that happens here in South Africa. They give a percentage of your salary to the unemployment insurance fund, and essentially when you are unemployed, you then give them papers and they give you like a monthly salary of some sort. Is it a lot of money? Not necessarily. There was a friend of mine that when she fell pregnant, she said that I need to have leave. So the company gave her leave, but only a couple of months. I think it was about 3 months or so. So she's like, no, I needed 4 months, and therefore I needed to obviously apply for UIF because during that month I'm actually considered unemployed because I'm not getting paid from the company in concern with my services and stuff like that. So she went to the UIF and obviously got a couple of funds around that. But I think it was about 300-500 rand. And in a month, I don't know if 300-500 rand would be money that you could hold on to, especially if you're about to give birth to a child. But in other countries, guys, you might find that because of the heavy taxes that they have, they've got a system where if you're unemployed, they will dispense a certain amount of money to you. There are certain goods that if you decide to go and buy, they're close to nothing. Basically just making sure that you can take care of yourself. But that's an expensive program, and South Africa is not there yet. Perhaps when you guys maybe join government or run initiatives, run your own companies and so forth, these are things that you look into. How do we take care of our staff to such extent where if they do become unemployed, we have some sort of fund for them going forward. For most people, what they end up doing is they take from their what's the thing called, a provision, not a provision fund, your retirement savings basically. And that obviously has some dire effects. It might serve you for now, but years later, you'd obviously have to replenish that money. Next sentence on page 450, being the second paragraph, it says there, but even the best system of unemployment benefits cannot entirely eliminate the cost of unemployment. The unemployed also suffer psychological costs. Enforced joblessness is demoralizing, results in loss of confidence and self-esteem. Increased unemployment tends to result in an increase in psychological disorders, divorces, suicides, and criminal activity. Now, to come to your point, Amber, in the next paragraph, unemployment also means a loss of experience and human development. Workers become unaccustomed to using their skills and may even lose them. So that one resource, one factor of production that you actually need to use consistently. On page 451, we look at the types of unemployment. And this is where some of the conversations that we had earlier on really come into play. Our first sentence on page 451 under types of unemployment, it says, there are various types of unemployment. The most basic and distinct is between voluntary and involuntary unemployment. Right, and this is me obviously saying I do not want a job, and somebody saying that I do want a job, but I can't seem to get one. The next paragraph then reads the following. Economists usually distinguish between frictional unemployment, seasonal unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. And there's just a question here that I saw. Ray, you asked the question, so with the resignation period, does it count as being employed or unemployed? It counts as being employed because what you're telling your employer is that I will work out this next month, I'll be paid for it, but as of the end of that month, I will then be unemployed. Right, let's look at frictional unemployment. It says here, frictional unemployment arises because it takes time to find a job or to move from one job to another. Just let me know in the chat about this specific idea, guys. When it comes to looking for a job versus you in a job looking for another job, who do you think finds a job faster? The one that has a job already or the one that is looking for a job for the first time? Monica says that, okay. Absolutely, guys. You're on the money, Monica. You're on the money, Amber. You're on the money, Amber. Ria, I mean to say. At the end of the day, the person that is in the job finds it much easier. There's a friend of mine that has, each time I talk to him, he's got some different job. And I'm like, how are you doing this? I don't get it. But then here comes, in this case, individuals that may have just finished their degrees, and to find a job, even though they see vacancies in the economy, to find a job is obviously a bit difficult. And maybe that's a word of hope that at the end of the day, if you keep obviously that process going, you will get into a position where you will find a job and things will get easier in that regard as well, because you would have built, as Rio was putting across, some sort of experience and some sort of skill set that other employers might be looking for. The next bit talks about seasonal unemployment, still on page 451. It says seasonal unemployment arises because certain occupations require workers for only a part of each year. This includes activities such as picking and processing fruit and vegetables, which have particular growing seasons. Guys, at the beginning of, or rather during the period when we're under lockdown and we're not able to purchase alcohol, right? What will end up happening with your wine farmers is that they were like, there's no point in picking grapes now, because if we pick grapes, we can't necessarily sell the wine. And that seasonal unemployment, that people would come in and basically get the grapes and either put them into some sort of I've forgotten what they call them, but basically the places where they would make the wine were not necessarily hired during that period, and that once again causes a bit of a problem. But even their job title as is, they could be considered unemployed because it's seasonal. When things are happening, you're employed. When things are not happening, you're unemployed. The next is cyclical unemployment, and it says it occurs when a slump or recession in the economy as a result of temporary lack of demand gives rise to unemployment. All right, and you guys will obviously realize that over the past year, right, because of COVID and so forth, there have been situations where people have been let go because of that. Sure, not a problem. So frictional unemployment in this case is when you are either one, looking for a job, right? And you're trying your best to always find a job. So there's a sense of I want a job, but that the job only comes after a specific period of time. So there's friction in between when you want the job versus when you get it. And vice versa, when you're inside a job, you leaving that job for another job. There's still some friction in between the time that you decide that decision and obviously the time when you actually get the job. I hope that makes more sense, Keaton. Nah, no problem. Anytime. Right, then the last one, guys, is structural unemployment. And it says here is somewhat more complex. Whereas cyclical unemployment is related to the fluctuations in the general state of the economy, structural employment is usually confined to certain industries, sectors, or categories of workers. Structural unemployment occurs when there's a mismatch between worker qualifications and job requirements, or when jobs disappear because of structural changes in the economy. I'd even argue the point that sometimes you'll find that within a specific bank, for instance, they might change a couple of things or how they do their business. And as a result of that structure change, people obviously then become unemployed. And this is where obviously things like retrenchment letters and stuff like that, become a thing. Are there any questions, guys, in concern with the types of unemployment? Yes, no. If not, just give me a thumbs up to say I'm good to go. We can continue going. Okay, perfect. All right. So on page 452, it talks about policies to reduce unemployment. Absolutely, Ria. Absolutely, absolutely. That would be the case. Um, that would definitely be the case. So some of these lead to unemployment. Some of them are people who are currently unemployed as well. All right. Guys, tell me in the chat, what would you do if you were hired to be the person who was, let's say, the Minister of Labor, right? What would you do to reduce unemployment? Mention one thing that you would do to reduce unemployment. You're in this tax life. You're in this tax life, Mr. Newman. You're in this tax life. Yeah. Amber, what's your take? Palesa, let me know. Hmm. Hmm. Guys, these are really some powerful ideas, eh? Some really powerful ideas, including yours, Kira, including yours. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So when we are dealing with, policies to reduce unemployment, we are looking at it from two perspectives, right? The first perspective is what we call the supply side. And then the second one is your demand side. Absolutely, Amber, absolutely, absolutely. Right now, I know that the obviously the golden thread that you guys are sharing is obviously this thing of providing skills, and I think that is definitely something that we should also be looking into. And in concern with that's the free training, the providing experience, encouraging small businesses as well. We need that type of thinking if we're looking at getting people in a space where they can finally start giving more to the economy. So your book says the following on the right hand side, and maybe it might shock some of you. Here we go. It says on the supply side, it has supply side in bold. Rapid population growth can be a significant cause of unemployment. Steps taken to limit population growth can thus be regarded as part of the strategy to reduce unemployment. Now, guys, this might sound shocking to you, but when we look at things like I'll just put that in green. When we look at things like your GDP and we look at things like your population growth, I'll call that PG. This is on page 500, yes, 452, 100% Kieran, right? There are two types of situations that you'll probably get. In the first situation, your GDP will be more than your population growth, but in the second, you'll find that your GDP is less than your population growth. Out of these two scenarios, 1 and 2, tell me in the chat, which is going to lead to unemployment? You can pick one or two. Which would lead to unemployment faster? Absolutely. 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 So when we talk about population growth, curbing population growth, this is when people obviously have campaigns, and I think China once upon a time had the whole one child per family. I don't think they still have it now. But things like that, for instance, allow economies to say, we don't have all the jobs in the world. So, but if you guys limit the amount of growth from a family perspective, we'll be able to try our best to obviously have a job out when this person obviously gets to that point. But if the population is growing faster than there are jobs, that becomes a bit of a problem, right? But this is also not a long-term strategy. The other strategy that obviously is implemented is immigration, right? For somebody to get a job here as a foreign national, you'll find that there's a lot more loops that they obviously have to jump through, right? Because what the country needs to do is make sure that obviously a citizen in the country has been employed, and it's priority when it comes to employment. So that's also a very important factor that people also do on the supply side. Right. Now, when we talk about our demand side, you guys will remember the following. Still around, still around. The equation is still around. Those are all demand factors.
So,
Consumption,
so do you
spending.
mind
Yes, go
if
ahead.
I just just sorry, I just wanted to butt in now before later, so I don't stop you in when your train of thought is there. I just wanted to ask, the GDP is greater than PG. Is that gross domestic product is greater than what?
Population growth.
Population. And then the second one is that, what is that?
GDP is less than
Oh,
population
then
growth.
what's on the right? Is that, oh, was that just mistake? I,
Yes, yes,
I
yes.
mean the left.
You mean next to the two?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Because I thought maybe it was P times P equal. I was like, whoa, okay.
No, not the case, man. Thanks for asking.
Oh, and then also, um, are these conditions of a demand side, or is it like, or is it just there while you were explaining?
Yes, yes, I'm still explaining it.
Okay, cool. Thank you, sir. I just thought I lost you, and I was like, what's cutting? But wait, thank you, sir.
A pleasure. All right. So when we talk about the demand side, guys, we're looking at your consumer spending, and we sit down and you say, how can we make the economy spend a whole lot more? When we look at investment spending, we're asking ourselves the question, how do we, and this is where Kieran will probably smile from um, ear to ear, how do we lower taxes? How do we lower taxes? And so on and so forth. Because if we have lower taxes, chances are people are going to spend a whole lot more. And this is also where ideas like interest rates dropping come into play as well. There's also government spending, making sure that the government spends a whole lot more. But the problem with government spending a whole lot more, guys, is at the end of the day, it means that there's inflation, and it also means that they need to have money to do that. And that only comes from taxes. So we don't necessarily want that. And then once again, net exports, in this case being that we want obviously to be in a space where there's a lot more exports leaving the country, because that will obviously give us some money, and a lot of less imports coming into the country. But we also know as South Africa that when it comes down to importing things, right, for someone to say we need to stop importing things and we need to grow things ourselves, or we need to, guys, that takes time, that takes expertise, and that takes money. And remember, the point at the end of the day for any type of business is how do we get to where we want to as fast and as soon as possible. So importing saves time, saves money as well. So just something there to also just think about. Both of these are basically ways that they can also do that. We also talked about things like small businesses. Amber, you put that across. The future of the world, whether we agree with this or not, and maybe I should say my personal opinion, the future of the world is really reliant on what we call an entrepreneur. The person who go out there, see opportunity, and be courageous enough to go and make something of themselves in that regard. Because they will find opportunities and create money that was not there initially. That is where the future of the world is. And countries that have really made sure that they grow their entrepreneurs, people looking for opportunities, and made a breeding ground of opportunity in that regard, usually do much better than countries that are a bit more traditional and more conservative in that regard as well. All right. But let's get down to some highlighting before we go on to our break. And we'll start off with the policies to reduce unemployment on page 452. Second paragraph on the right, it says on the supply side, rapid growth, or we already read that, apologies. Let's go to page 453, right? First paragraph on the left, last sentence, says stricter immigration control can therefore also be regarded as an element of policy strategy to reduce unemployment. And this will also happen, guys, if you decide to immigrate, you'll also face more or less the same thing. Then you'll find the sentence, other relevant features of the supply of labor in South Africa are like shortage of skills and oversupply of unskilled and semi-skilled labor. There's too much of the wrong type of labor. All right, and just continue highlighting that sentence, and obviously the sentence that has the demand side, right, which really talks about how do we empower people's skills in order for them to obviously get jobs or to create businesses of their own. Just on the demand side, I want to just read that. It's still on page 453. It says, on the demand side, additional employment opportunities can be created by raising the aggregate demand for goods and services and increasing the labor intensity of production. If more goods and services have to be produced, more job opportunities will be created and the greater labor force intensity of production. The more favorable the ratio between growth in output and the growth in the labor demand will be. And let me just read that again. The more favorable the ratio between the growth in output and the growth in the labor demand will be. So you'll find that sometimes with certain companies or certain institutions, they'll say, if you decide to hire people as opposed to buy machines, we'll issue out a subsidy. Things like that obviously allow for things like that to happen. I'm sure you guys have also heard of internships. Internships is also another way that they begin to look at how do we ensure that people are getting some sort of skill. And as soon as you're done with your internship, they will then issue you out with a certificate to let people know that, hey, this individual has some sort of skill of some sort. Last two concepts before our break. On page 454, it says unemployment, inequality, and poverty. We discussed this in chapter 12 when we looked at things like the Gini coefficient and your Lorenz curve as well. Those are concepts that we obviously discussed in inequality. I think what's important here to note, guys, is that inequality is a very serious thing. Wherever a country breeds this thing called poverty, it really becomes a bit of a problem in the future, because that's when you find countries or people that are obviously at the bottom of that food chain will sit down and say, guys, we're tired, and if you don't change things, we'll change things for ourselves. And we obviously wouldn't want a situation like that. I think a small microcosm of that idea was obviously the looting that happened recently. Very careful. And I say that obviously with the deep amount of respect for anybody that I don't look down on those individuals at all. It's just bringing it to the fore to say that something needs to be done about the inequality, always. Then the last thing, guys, on page 457, it says a solution to unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And basically, guys, what people are looking to do is give a grant, right? And not grant the lecturer. In this case, they're talking about grant as a fund. And we'll talk about that a bit more when you guys come back. So I'll see you guys in exactly 10 minutes time, being 4 o'clock.